Today we're taking a look at a truly awesome game, played by the future world chess champion. Yes, I said it, I think this kid is headed to the top, and when I say kid, I'm not only referring to his status as a member of the human species, but I'm also making use of another meaning of the word kid, which is a young goat. Because, at the risk of sounding redundant, I do believe that he just might have the potential to become the greatest chess goat the world has ever seen. I'm of course talking about the superpowered 11-year-old prodigy from Argentina, Faustino Oro, who in the bullet game you are about to behold, played recently on chess.com, severely chastises a 3200 rated GM by the name of Alexander Bortnik with a brilliant queen-sacrificing sequence of moves that is 100% guaranteed to delight and astound you. You will get your chess fix for the day, maybe even for the whole week, unless you're a hardcore chess addict like me. But enough said, you're going to love this one. Faustino Oro is on fire, he's out of control, he's got the black pieces, which means Alexander has team white, and he opens with d4. Faustino responds knight to f6, the famous and flexible Indian defense, preventing white from immediately establishing his ideal duo with e4. We have the slightly unusual knight to c3, blocking the c pawn, which white will more normally push to c4, taking more pawn control in the center. But after d5 from Faustino, Alexander is now able to follow up with bishop to f4, with the potential to play a quick knight to b5, converging on the c7 square with knight and bishop. Faustino says, no thank you, I'll play a6, stopping that idea in its tracks. Next is e3, activating the f1 LSB. Faustino does the equivalent with e6, although this blocks his light-squared bishop's diagonal. Next is a3, which the engine thinks is a bit slow. Apparently Alexander wants to prevent bishop to b4 here, but instead of that, what do you think the all-powerful computer program Stockfish 17 was recommending for white? If you said h4, then you are strong in the ways of AlphaZero. This is of course the modern engine-inspired way to attack, which paradoxically is quite primitive looking. You just push your h-pawn as far as you can, whether you've castled or not, and that's all you really need to know. Okay, there might be a little more nuance to it than that, but these guys are playing like good red-blooded human beings as Faustino now continues bishop to d6. And here's an instructive moment. How is one to deal with the threat of bishop takes bishop damaging the white pawn structure? Well, the answer, according to Alexander, is to just ignore it and play knight to f3. At which point you'll see a lot of beginners go ahead and play bishop takes f4, thinking they've achieved something significant. But after e takes f4, white is fully compensated for his compromised pawn structure due to his increased control of the center, locking down the e5 square, where it will now be much more difficult for black to push a pawn, freeing his light-squared bishop. Faustino, well aware of this, decides to just castle. We now have knight to e5, violating a general opening principle which says don't move a piece twice in the opening. Of course, all chess rules do have exceptions, and if you're wondering what the exception is here, well, that's a very good question. The engine slightly preferred bishop to d3, or even that h4 move, but okay, the knight is on a cosmetically pleasing central post. Faustino now strikes at the center with c5, as one does, looking to undermine a key defender of white's knight on e5, which black would like to argue has been prematurely posted. If white were to just continue with his development with bishop to d3, then black could gain some oppressive space with c4. There's also the idea of just increasing pressure on the e5 knight with queen to c7, thus rendering d takes c5 unplayable for white, unless he wants to lose his knight. So Alexander decides to take on c5 while he can, giving up his most central pawn to bishop takes c5, not ideal for white, but this does remove an attacker of his proud pony on e5, and he can now play bishop to d3 without having to worry about black playing c4. And that just might be the best move. But Alexander decides to go for queen to f3, with the very double-edged idea of castling on the queen side. It's a bold thing to try, especially when you've played a3, giving black a little something to potentially nibble on with a future b5 followed by b4. Faustino plays knight to c6, Alexander does castle to the west, at which point Faustino misses his best line of play, which is to take the knight on e5, and after the bishop recaptures, play knight to d7, hitting the bishop, followed by b5, threatening to disrupt the white king's pawn cover with b4. But he instead puts his bishop back to d6, giving Alexander the chance to initiate the knight trade with knight takes c6. This was not played in the game, but it just might be best, since after b takes c6, bishop takes d6, and queen takes d6, there is no more b5 and b4 for black. Of course, the b file is now opened, which might look a bit concerning, but that's actually not so dangerous for white. It's going to take black a few moves to get the queen and rook battery lined up on b2, and even then white can always defend with b3 or maybe knight to a4 and then b3, and in the meantime white will be launching his own pawn storm on the king side with his g and h pawns. So the position does favor black a bit, but nothing to get in a twist over. What's played in the game after bishop to d6 is knight to d3, bringing the bishops into contact, and here I'll bet you won't guess what black's most engine-approved move is. What would you play here? Knight to e8 is actually best, preparing to meet bishop takes bishop with knight takes bishop, eyeing some very nice potential outposts on c4 and e4. If white doesn't trade the bishops, then black can play e5, which incidentally is the move Faustino plays in this position, only here with his knight on f6, Alexander has the equalizing move bishop to g5, pinning the f6 knight to the queen. Of course, Faustino does have the very scary looking e4, which he does now play, forking white's knight and queen, but believe it or not, this move is actually an inaccuracy. The engine liked bishop to e6 much better, since after Alexander's strong reply, bishop takes f6, counterattacking the black queen. However black recaptures, white will emerge the superior side. If queen takes queen, then white can trade queens and then play knight to f4, hitting the totally undefended pawn on d5 with 3 pieces. Faustino wisely avoids that losing line and plays g takes f6 instead, after which it does appear that white will be losing a piece. And there's a good reason for that, since after queen to h5, the best move now played by Alexander, Faustino can and now does capture the knight on d3. However, after bishop takes d3, white is handsomely compensated by his very serious threats to black's shattered king side, namely the threat of queen takes h7 checkmate. f5 is the only reasonable defense, to which white's best response might just be g4, attacking that pinned pawn a third time while threatening to open the g-file, which the black king should probably immediately vacate with king to h8, when after e takes f5, white has gained 2 pawns for the lost piece and might have a slight advantage. What's played is knight takes d5, which the engine doesn't like quite as well, but this move gets 10 out of 10 for trickiness. Gotta hand it to Alexander, he's gonna make Faustino walk a pretty loose tightrope if he is to avoid plummeting to his demise, since after bishop to e5, exposing an attack on the knight, Alexander's brilliant follow-up g4, offering his young opponent a second piece, and queen takes d5 played by Faustino, he's now got bishop takes f5 with both the discovered attack on the black queen and the threat of checkmate on h7. So not looking good for Team Black here, who doesn't seem to have a way to save her royal majesty on d5. What would you play here? There is but one move that doesn't lose, and it's not an easy one to spot. The single game-saving move that Faustino now finds and executes is bishop takes b2 check, which almost looks random until you realize that if the king were to recapture, then black can play queen to e5 check, followed by queen to g7, defending h7 with a winning position. So what's played is king to b1, maintaining that dual threat of checkmate and rook takes d5, and again, Faustino finds the best move, which is not the losing queen takes d1 check, which is what I think a lot of us would try here, since after rook takes d1, bishop takes f5, and g takes f5, black can retreat his bishop to g7, which the engine says is best. So black has emerged with 2 minor pieces and a rook for his lost queen and 2-pawn deficit. However, after queen to h4, white is threatening to play f6, which will be quite oppressive and winning according to the almighty engine. f6 might be black's best try here, although that's pretty sad for the bishop on g7, which is now looking like a tall pawn. Faustino, displaying wisdom well beyond his years, can see that this goes nowhere, and in the game, plays the much better move, the only good move, bishop takes f5. We do have the removal of the black lady on d5. Faustino gets his clergyman out of danger with bishop to g6, attacking the queen, very important, so that after queen to h6, he can get his other bishop out of danger while grabbing another pawn with bishop takes a3. Looks pretty reasonable, right? I thought so, but bishop takes a3 is actually a losing blunder, which is why Faustino doesn't play it. He instead puts his bishop on g7, driving the white queen from h6. Why is this important? Well, one reason has to do with the move f4, threatening to trap the bishop on g6, which black would love to meet with bishop to e4, hitting both white rooks at the same time. However, after rook to h5, there is no bishop takes h1 unless you're one of those weirdos who actually enjoys a good stout checkmating on h7. White's going to continue to push his g and h pawns, and Bob's going to be someone's new uncle in very short order. And there are a few more intricacies to this line that we could try to probe together, but I want to crack on with the game, where in this position, whether by instinct or by rapid-fire calculation, Faustino knows that he needs to leave the pawn on a3 alone and play bishop to g7, putting another piece in front of his king with an attack on the white queen, which now goes to f4. This is the best square, guarding against any bishop to e4, supporting a quick e4 to block the g6 bishop's diagonal, since it does have the potential to converge on the weak c2 pawn with the help of a rook on c8. And this is a good place to stop and assess the position. Black has exactly 3 minor pieces for his queen, which would give him material equality if not for white's 2-pawn surplus. However, he does have the bishop duo bearing down on the white king's castle, giving him more than sufficient compensation. So it's still anybody's game here. Faustino now plays rook f to e8, maybe looking to play bishop to e4 at some juncture, but after the blunderous h4 now played by Alexander, he has the foresight to avoid it, seeing that bishop to e4 can be met with rook to g5, and bishop takes h1 with queen to f6, attacking the pinned bishop, threatening mate in 1. King to f8 is the only saving move, but after rook takes g7, threatening mate on f7 now, rook to e7 defending while giving the king an escape route in view of rook takes h7, threatening mate on h8, and the necessary king to e8. White has rook to h8 check, king to d7, and rook takes a8, picking up the rook with a winning position. Now, did the young prodigy have this all worked out in a bullet game? Who knows? I wouldn't put it past him. What I do know is that in the game, Faustino does not play the losing bishop to e4, but he doesn't find the winning move either, which is apparently rook to e4, defended by the bishop, looking to go to c4 next, hitting c2, then maybe to c3, pressuring a3 as well. It's all very annoying for white, but I wouldn't necessarily guess that it gives black a 2-pawn advantage, as the engine is now claiming. What Faustino plays is h6. It's not the worst thing he could have done. At least there's no rook to g5 for the moment. Alexander doubles his rooks on the open d file, as one tends to do. Next is knight to e5, a strong move, planting that stallion on a beautiful central square where it's doubly defended. Actually, I'm just kidding. This is really a terrible move, and one that gives white a totally winning position. Again, rook to e4 was best, but see if you can figure out what's wrong with knight to e5. What should white play here? The best move, now played by Alexander, is h5, attacking the bishop. Okay, it goes to h7, no big deal. Except that the straightforward pawn push to g5 here would kind of be a big deal, threatening to open the g-file, which is not conducive to the good health of the geriatric black king. Why Alexander doesn't play this very standard file opening move, I don't know. He instead opts for queen to a4, throwing away his entire winning advantage. And if you're wondering why this move was played, welcome to the club, because I can't really say for sure. Maybe he's clearing the way for a possible f4 and didn't know where else to put his queen. Maybe he likes the fact that he's eyeing the rook on e8. Whatever his flawed thinking is, Faustino now continues with a very strong move, rook a to c8, hitting that c2 square a second time. And this brings us to a tricky moment. What would you play as white? The only good defense is going to be rook to c5, defending the c2 pawn and ready to meet rook takes c5 with queen takes undefended rook on e8. That would not be good for black. What Alexander plays, though, is the severely dubious rook 1 to d2, which fails instantly to knight to c4, attacking the rook, which white has no way to move out of danger, while also preventing black from playing knight to b6 on his next move, forking queen and rook. Which is why Alexander just moves his queen here to b3, letting the rook go to knight takes d2 check, and after rook takes d2, Faustino has a totally winning position. Queen takes b7 is not a threat, of course, since then black would have a rook to b8, winning the white queen. But Faustino thrusts his pawn forth anyway with b5. Alexander now decides it would be a good idea to get his king out of the line of fire of black's two snipers on g7 and h7, so he begins heading over towards the queen side with king to c1. And after bishop to e4, we have king to d1, and now rook to c3, hitting the white queen. She goes to b4. We have bishop to f3 check, attacking the king, who despite being defended by the rook, does still need to move per the rules of the game. Alexander plays king to e1, but now comes a delightful move, rook to c4, hitting the queen, hitting the pawn on g4, which incidentally was already hit by the bishop, while also clearing the way for bishop to c3, which after queen to d6 by Alexander is exactly what Faustino plays, pinning the rook on d2 to the king. Alexander goes into full crisis mode now and just starts running towards the king side, or should I say his king starts running with king to f1. Faustino does take the rook on d2, and after queen takes d2, black's got a big material advantage, 2 rooks for the queen plus the bishop. This is just utter carnage now. We have rook takes g4, queen to d7 attacking the rook, it goes to e6, a check is executed, a king goes to g7, we have queen to c7 fulfilling the requirement to move, rook to f6 getting lined up on the nervous king, queen to e5 pinning that rook to the king, rook to g5 attacking the queen, queen to c3, rook takes free pawn on h5, threatening mate in 1 now. Alexander tries to run back towards the queen side with king to e1, but to no avail, and after rook to h1 check, he decides it's time to tender his resignation, seeing that mate will be delivered unto his king on the very next move when king to d2 will be followed by rook to d1 checkmate. So what did you think? I know it wasn't a perfect game, but it's bullet. What more can you ask for? And I think the moments of brilliance in this one more than made up for the numerous blunders. Faustino's now got an online rating of over 3,100, and he's only 11. I mean, just think about that. It's insane. But anyway, that's it for now. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the content and want more of the same in the near future. Smash that like button and leave a comment. Those things really help the channel out, and I will see you soon.